Welcome to our first episode of the Unicorn Whisperer for 2026. We're joined by a very special guest, someone I've been very interested to talk to, Daniel Illis, coming to us from the UK,
That's right. I'm actually Hungarian, but I live in London.
living in London for now. Any plans to go back to Hungary?
No, no.
Not in the near future. Okay, well, you have
I
a
would
very
hope.
interesting background. You and I shared an experience in terms of working at the ride shares back in the expansion period, and so it's always interesting to hear. This podcast focuses on a few things, right? Like, how did people get to where they are today, and kind of what's something people could take away from that experience, and then diving in on some of the things that you're good at, which we will get into. But it's always interesting for me to see somebody make that transition into the people side of things coming from the operating end. And so I'm very curious to hear, we have this thing at Unicorn Talent where there's a part of it where we coach people through their first interview. And one of them is like,
Yeah.
summary, get the story down. What's the story of your career for that first question to tell me about yourself in an interview? How would you answer that question?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me. I'd say this people and talent stuff is probably my third career.
Okay.
So I started out as a lawyer, as a capital markets lawyer, which is very, very different world to what I do today. But essentially, I did that for a couple of years. Basically, wrote 1,000-page books that no one would ever read. In a nutshell, that was the gig. So it wasn't particularly exciting. But one part of it that was exciting was learning about businesses. So I had to kind of get to know CFOs and understand their companies, so I can basically very clearly articulate their business in the kind of offering documents that you need for these capital markets transactions. And that was kind of the thing that made me think, okay, well, I'm not enjoying this, but I do really enjoy learning about businesses. Maybe kind of going to a business and sort of stepping away from professional services, being a lawyer would be a good move for me. I was still very young and I thought, you know what? Now's the time. If not now, when? So I basically amped up my networking a little bit, managed to convince a friend I made in a bar in LA to take a chance on me and hire me at Lyft into a non-legal role that had absolutely nothing to do with what I knew. And that was my first kind of operating role. So I was a launcher at Lyft. I was part of the team that set up Lyft in new cities. And that was really the beginning of a string of roles, sort of very much in the kind of generalist realm, basically being a builder, doer, doing whatever we need to do to get the company to succeed. Ultimately, I co-founded a company called Drover, which is a car subscription marketplace here in the UK. And I was sort of a generalist kind of COO type person for much of the, I guess, early couple of years. And it was really there that I thought, you know what? Everything that's ever gone wrong in this company had at its core a hiring or people problem. We hired the wrong person, we didn't onboard them properly, or we didn't think about the team dynamics that we needed to think about. So I kind of had this epiphany that this stuff is way more important than I ever thought. And actually, I think I can be good at learning this. I also thought that maybe there was an opportunity for an accelerated career in people. I felt like there was a lot of demand for commercially minded people leaders, but maybe um, sort of a bit of a supply challenge. And so I thought, you know what, this is maybe what I should do with my career moving forward. So essentially double down on the people and talent stuff, learn everything I could from all sorts of resources, mentors, etc., and rebranded myself as a people leader, and ultimately got to Vinted, which is for the US listeners, it's a large peer-to-peer secondhand marketplace in Europe. It's just posted over €1 billion in revenue last year. And I was there for quite a few years, sort of, helping manage that pretty chaotic growth phase. It was really fun, but also, pretty intense and stressful, but I wouldn't change anything about it. Now I'm at Atomico, which is a large multi-stage European venture capital firm, and I work in a kind of portfolio facing role, essentially taking what I've learned at Vinted and sort of previously as well, and advising founders on anything and everything to do with people, recruiting, specifically exec hiring as well. And hoping to, very much we have aligned incentives with them and hoping to kind of get them better at those things. So that's the story in a nutshell.
No, I love it. I would argue that I had a few points that I'm gonna go through the story. But one, the legal background played with the expansion role at Lyft, whether it was direct or indirect. I remember, especially when, I don't know if you were around for like going into some of the crazier cities, but like the
I was.
Vegases of the world, right? Like, having someone with a little legal background on the ground helped probably extract the story as that battle
Oh,
happened,
for
or,
sure.
you know,
Yeah,
so there's definitely a part of that role there.
totally. And we actually, we did have a policy team who sort of managed those relationships with government, but they often brought us in to kind of help them those meetings because we just understood the product inside out in a
Right.
way that maybe they didn't, at least from the driver's side. So yeah, definitely helped.
And I presume you're a part of the transition for the new hires, right? Once you launch a city and get the initial rides going, you're probably handing off to the GM or whoever's
Yeah,
operating the city at a time. So there's a
yeah,
certain element where you're getting this taste of how does hiring, because when you see multiple cities, right? Like I'm sure, I was a recruiter at Uber at the time. And so when you get a
mhm,
GM, you're sure that that GM is great for your city. But at the same time, if you're a launcher, you've seen 10, 20 cities, you now have this data set that I didn't
mhm.
have as a recruiter where you're like, well, this is what works in hiring and what doesn't work. You could probably bring that back from an advisory perspective. And that's what I'm assuming is kind of the roots of you saying like, hey, hiring could sometimes be the root cause of all
Yeah.
things
No, you're totally right.
operations.
You're totally right. And like even just looking at Lyft, the sort of GM you'll need for a peer-to-peer city is very different from say New York City, where there's an established driver community that you sort of be able to connect with and speak to. So it's a different type of profile that will be able to do that. So yeah, absolutely. It was the first taste of that.
Now, in my world, so before Unicorn Talent was what it is today, which is this consulting, right? This community, it was consulting. So I used to, similar, but as an external for investment firms, advise companies about their people and recruiting processes. That's just context. The main
Mhm.
point I want to bring is I want to call it perception, or maybe it exists a little bit, and I don't know how much I'll hit on something that's true, is there's two schools of people leaders, and they may or may not believe they're the ones that is the correct path. There's people brought up through the people space. I was a people ops coordinator, then an HR VP, and then I was
Mhm.
a director of people, and now I'm a chief people officer, right? And there's this other side where yeah, I was an attorney, I was an operator, now I'm a people officer. And regardless of which one works well for your business, I don't think there's a right or a wrong. There's obviously things that one has to do that the other one has to learn. And so what is your relationship with the career people that
Yeah.
came up through the process? Like, what do you find the difference to be? And if you're going to advise somebody who is
Sure.
attempting to get into people, what do you say to learn? And then for the folks that exist that are people, like what can they take away from your experience that you think is like the most impactful, um, you know,
Yeah.
given
Yeah.
your rather quick rise to a fairly coveted title?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'd say I'm with you. So there is no right answer. I think people coming from a traditional people background can have fantastic careers in HR leadership, and same goes the other way. I think both camps have a lot to learn from each other. I'd say um, what is really good about folks coming um, from a more diverse background, having done a bunch of different operating roles, is that they'll just have a bit, I guess, a more honed instinct for the business. They'll understand the peers that now, as a people leader, they're charged with coaching and supporting, um, kind of at a more granular level. So if you've done marketing, if you've sort of built a sales team, or advised engineers as a product person, you'll have a better understanding for what sort of challenges these leaders face. And so I think that, and also you'll likely have been more exposed to things like a P&L. You'll probably be have gotten used to numbers a bit more. So all of that is great, and I think the best people leaders are have this. So they're commercial, they're data minded. They have a deep understanding for the business that they're supporting, and sort of the different functions that make up that business. But on the other hand, I also don't love it when um, you know people leaders coming from non HR backgrounds kind of um, not look down on, but sort of discourage, let's say, CEOs from hiring traditional people backgrounds, because those folks have a real depth of understanding around the craft. They understand, they've seen different pillars of the people function work in different ways, and that's really important too. I think I I think the best place to be is essentially pattern recognition. So understanding whether if you've done this thing before in HR, can it work in another company? And sort of having some confidence around what are some principles that you're pretty strict on that will work across the board, but also having the humility to and willingness to rethink and recognize when the pattern isn't the same. And I think if you're coming from a non-traditional background, you basically don't have a choice because you'll just know less of those playbooks. So you're gonna have to
Right.
rethink more. You're gonna have to learn a lot more to begin with. um, so yeah, I think it's the truth is somewhere in between. Both camps have a lot to learn from each other.
I run a podcast called The Headcount Experts with this guy, Chris Mannion. He came from being an operator in the Navy, went to
Uh,
MIT, and then moved into people. And so he and I are always one, I think it just works really well for the podcast because I'm the grown up through recruiting person, and he's the one that came in from the outside. And we always have these differing perspectives. And it's kind of like what we landed on is you watch Catch Me If You Can, the Tom Hanks, right? So it's like the best fraud detector is the person who probably committed a little fraud themselves, right? So, like, it's one thing to set the rule and enforce it based on best practice because Sherm
yep,
told you to, and you have to stay. Everyone should do, but when it's time to launch a city and you gotta make a call on, I'm either gonna launch the city and get the revenue, or
yep,
do whatever you're gonna do for Vinted or WeWork, right? Like, you have great experience. You have to go out and sometimes maybe be the rule breaker to then understand the rule itself and maybe apply a guideline, a framework, an application of this rule to the business that bridges the gap between I need to achieve some operational result and I've been doing it by the book perfectly HR style.
yep,
And so there's a approach difference there that you'll see come out in different ways, and whether or not coming up outside, right? The legal experience arguably is extremely relevant as it relates to some of the sides of HR. And so there's this, it's not like you've been away from what HR is,
yep.
but it's one of those things where that seems to be the differentiator between the people founder relationship, which is likely how you've landed. Whenever I'm doing these podcasts, I'm always trying to unravel, how did somebody get to this position? I think, especially when you see the people who are downloading the unicorn resources, I watch them go through their career, I'll have conversations with them.
Mhm.
They're trying to get to a place where you are. And so the question is like, okay, I am at XYZ company. I'm a big company. Should I go startup? I'm in a pure HR role. Should I go operator? What are the things, right? Like, when you came from your operating experience, what are you advising your chief people officers now
Mhm.
within the portfolio? Like, what are the things that you see? What's the trends that you see? We could buzzword it with AI or not, but like, what are the things that you're advising people to do today that you feel like comes directly from your experience? What's like a common thread? Any theme that you deliver in your advisory or consultation to CPOs or the upcoming CPOs in the portfolio?
Yeah. I guess the answer is a little bit different if you talk about upcoming. So like how to actually get into the role versus sort of how to think about the problem set before you when you're in the role. I think in terms of how to get into the role, to me, it's. I mean, I'm not gonna. I don't think I've managed to do this because I'm any sort of genius. I think it's involved tremendous luck, to be honest. But I think there's something to say about putting yourself in luck's way, putting yourself out there, being conscious of your brand that you're building, whether that's on LinkedIn or wherever, telling a clear story about who you are and what sets you apart from other people leaders. I think specifically leaning into kind of how commercial you are, how data informed you are, and how you can think with empathy for leaders, not just the CEO, but the rest of the exec team as well. I think that's definitely a good place to be for when you're trying to sell yourself. I think when you're already in the role, what do I advise folks to look at? I mean, look, you could spend a lot of time on this, but I essentially my first a few things. So my first thing I always tell CEOs and sort of new incumbent chief people officers is what's going on with hiring. If you're a high growth company, which a lot of the companies that your listeners work at will be, and certainly the companies that I support in the Atomico portfolio are. Every hire is an opportunity to take your company to the next level, raise the bar, but it's also an opportunity to lower the bar, and ultimately every hiring mistake will compound over time because people that you shouldn't have hired will hire more people that don't do well at your company, and that it just turns into a huge problem. So basically, no matter how many fires you have burning with the team that you already have, if you're hiring a lot of people right now and you're growing fast in terms of headcount, fix that first. Like, figure that out. make sure that you're optimizing for as few false positives and false negatives as you can. Make sure that you have a good process that yields the right signal. So that's kind of my first, I guess, piece of advice to folks, like focus on hiring, fix that. I would say second, there's a lot of opportunity cost in being part of an ineffective leadership team. So I would say second thing is pay attention to leadership team dynamics in the company. Is this exec team working? Do they see each other as the first team? Do they um, is there healthy conflict? If you sort of think about the five dysfunctions of a team, like do people trust each other? Do they commit to decisions that they make? Do they hold each other accountable? Like think about these problems because especially if you're joining an organization with an existing people team, a lot of the problems that exist in the sort of people realm, your team will solve, right? Like if there's a people ops issue and something's broken about your onboarding or whatever it is, obviously you need to be thinking about it and you need to make sure that someone's picking it up, but someone else can do that. But no one else can, no one else is part of the leadership team. No one else has that privileged access and insight into the leadership team. And it's a huge lever to kind of having a healthy company. So that would be my second thing, like look at that. And I think the third thing is comp. I think that I find that if you figure out comp, and by figuring out comp, I mean you make it a non-issue. It's a thing that just works. And basically because it works, no one really talks about it and it's sort of forgotten. You have created so much leverage and wide space for actually value creative work in the company. I find that if you figure out comp and actually have a system that just works and people get it, people understand why they're paid what they're paid, like the noise stops and so many of the other problems just go away. And so that's kind of the third one I always recommend folks to think about.
Hiring, leadership team effectiveness, comp.
Yeah.
The interesting thing that you brought up, so I kind of pulled it up in the background here, is the five
Uh-huh.
dysfunctions of a team, right? So trust,
Uh-huh.
conflict, commitment, accountability, and results.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so easy transition here, right? Like when you're
Mhm.
focusing on those kind of three things that you were talking about, you're talking about the five dysfunctions of the team, you're talking about it at the executive level, right? And when
Mhm.
you're building out the first executive team, especially in a scaling company, right? Getting the kind of infrastructure correct so that you can grow without any inhibition or without any kind of, if it starts at the top, it will only be amplified. And as that executive continues to build around whatever their principles are. So if they're not aligned and or they're not at the quality or the bar that you're expecting,
Mhm.
then they're just going to disseminate down through the organization. Becomes a very tough problem to rectify down the
Mhm.
line. But
Yep.
in the
Yep.
world of the five dysfunctions of a team, I want to get into how you assess and identify, and then how do you build a hiring process around finding a fit, right? So I think in the executive hiring world, the idea of culture, so there's a thing that at the tactical level I hate, but at the executive level I love, and it's called culture. And it's like,
Uh-huh.
the reason why I dislike it at the tactical level is because it's very difficult to get many different line managers with differing opinions on what something subjective is,
Yep.
rather than a small team of executives to align on something like the five dysfunctions of a team or some other framework to say, like, this is our
Uh-huh.
criteria to do so.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm just interested to hear, as you are in this new role now, kind of focus on
Yeah.
building out the executive cohesion, let's call it,
Yeah.
and you're doing a lot of the hiring or partnering to do a lot of the hiring. How are you thinking about this kind of philosophy and building out an executive team at a new
Yeah.
company? And what should the listeners take away from that strategy?
Yeah, yeah. So like I think before you hire a new executive, I think it's good to have a think about and basically audit your effectiveness as it is today. There is a difference between a leadership team that is dysfunctional because people don't trust each other, or maybe they're sort of clinging to some sort of artificial harmony because they don't have the psychological safety to discuss things and debate things and put things out there, or they're sort of, they don't have it's not part of the team's culture to call each other out and hold each other accountable. So that's like one way of being dysfunctional. And I think another one is like, okay, you have actually a fairly well functioning exec team, but there are some cracks around, say, ownership. There's some projects or areas that as the company grows become more complex and suddenly kind of bleed into each other's areas of ownership, or maybe there's a clear hole. It's working well, but it's very clear that a new thing has emerged because the company has grown significantly, and maybe now there's a new thing to pay attention to. For instance, at Vinted, for us, it was corporate affairs. We actually had I would say, really well functioning team for the most part. But we realized that with the rise of Vinted and sort of crazy growth over a few years, corporate reputation management just became a thing that wasn't a thing before. And so that's another example of like there is a whole, but the whole thing isn't dysfunctional. So I'd start by saying, yeah, have a think about like what is the state of the team as it is. You know, if you don't have some of those basics like trust, healthy debate, commitment, etc., I think it's going to be really hard for you to bring on. First of all, it's going to be hard for you to align on who you even need, what sort of profile you even need to bring on. And then once they do come on board, it's going to be hard for them to create value in that environment. So if you've got a problem, sort of work on fixing it first. And then once you're confident that, okay, I'm not ready to kind of hire this new person. And by the way, they won't fix it for you. So they'll come in and they'll get lost in the chaos if there's guys. They're unlikely to solve it for you. But once you're confident, you're ready to expand a team and bring someone on board. Then yeah, how do I think about that? So to me, it's the most important thing with exec hiring is scoping. You know, you sort of alluded to this earlier, but if you say you want to hire a say CMO, I guarantee you, every single person on the exec team has a different idea for what that means and how they're planning to work with this person and what they're expecting from this person. Unless you get that disagreement on in a meeting or on a page, and sort of very very clearly align on what this role owns, what success looks like in say 12 months or whatever time frame, and sort of what is the hole that they're going to fill within your team. You're gonna struggle because if you all have a different idea and you don't align, I think what you're gonna see is a bunch of great candidates go through the process, meeting one person, then another person, and no one ends up being a consistent yes because, well, you're just looking for different things. So it's a yes for one person because they happen to meet the criteria of what that particular exec is hoping for, but not the other one, right? So it's a waste of time for the candidate. It's certainly a waste of time for the team. So first things first, more important than in any other setting, I think, is just to clearly align on what this role actually is. What are we expecting from the person joining in terms of impact in some time period, and what are they going to own? What decisions are they going to be charged with, and what decisions belong to other people within the team? So it starts there, right? And I think this is the step that a lot of companies just don't do.
Let's talk about that real quick. So you have X amount of companies in the portfolio. So I
Mhm,
presume pre-process, right? Before that first
mhm,
candidate ever makes it into the first interview process, there's this pre-process scoping. And so you have kind of like a company profile, which is size, stage, growth, like what
mhm,
is the industry, the condition. So you have kind of like the company profile here. Then you have the exec team profile, which could be based off of the five dysfunctions or other frameworks that kind of assess
mhm,
like what is the environment that this executive is working
mhm,
for. And then you kind of have this extended intake session process. So intake session for us on Unicorn, we have this download that says like, what are the three competencies of a person? What does success look like? What's the interview process? And we scope that. And at a tactical level, it's much easier to do that kind of in a singular nature, where in an exec world, every role is kind of a net new job title, right? It's almost like you're doing it for the first time because you have a new company profile, a new executive function, and new opinions from each person about how it should be. So what you're basically doing is almost, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is my
mhm.
perception, is
Yeah.
you're essentially doing an intake session with each individual exec to get their perception and saying, here are the things we agree on, here are the things that need a discussion. And part of those things are what are they going to do and with what scope. The other part is like, what does success look like? So if you interview 5 execs and you do these 30 to 1 hour intake sessions about what a
Mhm.
CMO is, you're kind of saying, here's the Venn diagram and this is what we need to agree on before I even get a first candidate in the door, and
Yep.
then you could build your pitch towards those candidates, right? You could do your profile
Yeah.
matching, etc.
Yeah, I
So is
think
that
that's
like,
broadly right. Yeah, that's
yeah,
broadly right. I mean, I actually, I've not. I think doing intake sessions with each individual and then coming together to discuss is a good idea. I've not done it that way. In the past, I've basically written out the sort of like an extended JD myself. By extended JD, I mean it included things like, what are the kind of must-haves, nice-to-haves with respect to this even need not-haves, by the way. So I find that sometimes the title kind of inherently carries the assumption of a particular attribute or trait being part of the role, but it may be that actually for your particular context and team, given the existing team composition, you don't really need to focus so much on that particular thing, right? So So yeah, nice haves, must haves, need not haves, kind of what success looks like, what they own in terms of numbers, decisions, etc. And then kind of come together and like go through that and folks can comment kind of async into a doc to kind of get those differing opinions on the table, and then yeah, come together, essentially discuss. And you typically want to have the CEO there, because if there's misalignment on the team, you want the CEO to just say no, they're not going to own that. I want you to keep owning that, whatever. But yeah, that would be my approach. Like, figure that piece out. And I think there's actually maybe an additional element here, which I haven't mentioned. I think can you like needs more attention, because I think you need to spend a bit of time. Assuming this is a CEO report, by the way, so assuming that this is a executive that's going to report to the CEO, I think you need to spend a bit of time with the CEO to make sure that they are clear on what they need, because what they want may not be what they need. And I think a lot, sometimes can fall for affinity bias. They've been owning this thing for a while, especially if it's a new area that doesn't have its own leader for now. So this is not a replacement exec, but kind of a net new exec. They've been
Right.
owning this thing for a while, and they're broadly happy with how they've been running it. But the motivation to bring in this person is because they can't handle the work anymore, because the company's grown and now they have sort of need to let go of this Lego. I think sometimes the initial instinct is to hire someone that's basically like a mini me that can just do what I've been doing, right? And I can just very easily hand over to them, and I trust them because they're like me and they're just gonna do a great job with it. I think as kind of a CPO or whatever capacity that you're in, you're advising on this exec hire, it's important to challenge the CEO on that, because they've been running it one way, and that's been good enough, but maybe there's an even better way. And actually we could, as a leadership team, really benefit from a new type of personality here. If the CEO is extremely data oriented and loves being in the detail, it may not be that your CEO needs to be that way too. Obviously, they need to be data informed. They need to be comfortable with working with numbers and reporting to you. You need to trust them to do a good enough job. But maybe now is an opportunity for this exec role to also bring in into the team another spike that maybe the CEO lacks, which, whatever it is, vision, kind of a real maturity in terms of the people management craft, or whatever it is, right? So there's that moment that I think you need to spend with the CEO to make sure we're not optimizing for finding someone just like them, but actually someone that is meaningfully different, and bring something new to the team that will not only set this function up for success, but actually strengthen the exec team in its kind of unique purpose as the company's the company's leadership team as a whole.
Yeah, I experience. I mean, my company's obviously in an earlier stage than most that you're advising, but yeah, I experienced something similar with the product for Headcount 365. It's like that's what I used to build as a recruiting leader, and now I'm
Mhm.
handing it off to a product leader who is taking what I'm doing beyond what is Eric's opinion on the thing. And the way I tie it back to what you were saying earlier is like my co-founder, my team has the ability to kind of bring that conflict, drive that accountability with me and say like, this is what you're missing as a product leader. And here's the benefits of doing so that we could go get a return on that investment from
Um,
someone with more experience who's built more than one product, who doesn't have an emotional tie to the business. So a lot of things that I can resonate with. It's now interesting seeing both sides, as I consider myself more an operator now than a recruiter, which is where I came from.
mhm,
But like seeing you kind of naturally go through those 5 dysfunctions and then apply them to a process that kind of mitigates the impact of what those dysfunction could have on a process probably
mhm,
means that the scoping that you're doing is tremendously efficient in getting to people, like getting to what a yes is from the people that you're involved in. And so another
mhm,
thing that we do on Unicorn Talent is we have this thing called the pitch document. A pitch document basically just for recruiting folks or for anyone aligning a process. It consolidates all of that scoping into the 2 things that we believe that executive will eventually say yes to, right? So executives, just like other candidates, take jobs for 2 reasons. One, it's a cooler job today. I am going to enjoy myself more than where I'm at today. And that could be I'm unemployed and I'm employed, but that could also mean the product, the space, the
Yep.
the team I'm working with is just a cooler experience today. And then the next thing is that this job will return for my future. It's going to, as I map my career path, this is somewhere I want to go. So if the
Yep.
success you're expecting isn't a milestone jump from my current success today, or the tasks you're asking me to do don't add or expand something to my repertoire, then I'm likely not going to take this job. So as you're kind of navigating the exec search kind of scoping process, you have to get 5 different executives whose time very valuable to then do an intake session so you could then bring it to another meeting to say like this. But all
Yep.
of that upfront investment is a return in the idea that you're going to spend way less time finding someone. The people who you do find will say yes faster. And as you go through the interview process and you align on what yes is beforehand, your debriefs, or in this case, like an executive discussion, are more aligned on like picking apart the nuances of why a no is a no based on these criteria and seeing what you can make compromises on or what you could develop on. And so, yeah,
Yep. Yep.
I really respect the process that you put together. And from a underlying thought process of getting to that, I'm learning today about the 5 dysfunctions, but like having this idea that there's this executive environment that you have to navigate on top of doing a more complex version of work that tactical recruiters at any level are doing.
Mhm.
It's just a cool way to hear about how folks are kind of approaching the exec search environment. Um,
Yeah.
like what are so how are you then translating this into an interview process, right? So
Yeah.
you know, I think you call it the
Sure.
gold star interview process, right? What does that mean to you? How do you get from scoping to process? And,
Yeah.
how do you advise our listeners to create an executive interview process that might be kind of
Yeah.
reflective of these best practices?
Yeah, yeah. Look, so I think hopefully the output of the intake piece or the alignment piece is kind of an aligned set of must-haves, nice-to-haves, need not haves, and that can that includes not just um, experiences, but really skills, knowledge wherever they've been gained. So you then kind of take that and think, okay, well, I've got a test for all of these, and it doesn't mean that I need to design interview questions for every single one of them. For some of them, like let's say one of your must-haves is crisp, compelling storytelling. Okay. The way you test for that isn't to ask about their storytelling skills or ask them to tell stories. It is you test it through listening to all the answers they give you otherwise and kind of assess that quality in those answers, right? So basically you take your brief, you take your list of attributes and you make a bit of a plan like, okay, this thing we're going to test between the lines for this thing we need to explicitly test for. And I think maybe the best way to test for that, if it's a technical piece, say, is to get our data science person to have a conversation with them, data science leader, to really understand like, okay, their data science understanding is not going to be, let's say this is a marketing role, it's not going to be to the same tune that you get from your chief data officer, but can they have a kind of eye-to-eye meaningful conversation with the chief data officer about marketing data? That's how you might choose to test for the technical piece. So yeah, you kind of have this map of like, okay, here's the thing we need, here's how we're going to test for it, and design a process around it. And I think, it probably has several stages. It almost certainly includes a task. Some people are not into this, and some people don't think this is needed. I guess like Cleva, I really disagree with that. I think giving people a meaty case study or brief is good for several reasons. It tests their well, obviously competence, and in particular, you can test the content of that presentation or write up or whatever it is, but also to some extent tests presentation, storytelling, communication skills, which is going to be a big part of succeeding at the exec level. But it also tests their motivation, right? So if an exec candidate comes back and says, I don't have time for this, that's kind of the answer you wanted, because you've just created a process that prompted this person to self-select out of it, because as soon as it required a bit of commitment, they couldn't do it. So I like to do a task. And in terms of what the task should be, obviously tailor it to the role. I've generally speaking found that for exec roles, doing something very open-ended is a good one, because it helps you see how they deal with big ambiguous problems, how they break them down and sort of show you, what they think really matters within that problem set. I would recommend you to make data available to them and actually make their peers available to them to ask questions kind of in a reverse interview format. So let's say your question is like, all right, what's your 1-year strategy for the marketing function? at X company, give them what they need to be able to answer that in context. Right? You don't want them to just download their marketing playbook on you that has no relevance to your business. You want them to really think about the situation at hand and actually deliver something highly relevant. Obviously, you need to be sort of mindful about crossing into kind of doing work for you territory, but I always think that those concerns are a bit overblown, to be honest. I've never seen that risk actually ever materialize. I've sort of seen LinkedIn stories of people doing quote unquote free work in the context of interview, but I've never encountered it in real life. So I don't know. I think you can be confident in giving them a meaty brief, equip them with the data, equip them with the coaching and the sort of information that they need to deliver a relevant piece. I like to leave it up to the candidate whether they deliver it as a presentation or maybe as a write-up and then kind of do a Q&A, whatever their style is. I would also say, like, if you're a CPO that's running this or an exec recruiter, like, become a concierge for this person, almost like a personal concierge for this candidate, right? Like, they're investing a lot in this process. If they're great, which hopefully they are, because that's why you want to hire them, they're going to have options. Like, one amazing way to build goodwill through the process is just, yeah, being this always available personal concierge to them, like coaching them through the process, giving them information on a kind of timely basis. What I did at Vinted once was we had a candidate fly into Vilnius for an interview, for a final interview. So this is after a long process already. And I had the hotel, and I basically had one of my team write a handwritten note, basically wishing them good luck and like recommending a path of walking to the office that's scenic. And I had them drop it off at the hotel and ask the hotel receptionist to put it in their room when they arrive. And it's such a small thing, but like, it's something, if they're in several different processes, this is something they're always going to remember. So like becoming this kind of almost like pulling out the red carpet and taking care of them, I think is really important. I would also say like this is a two-way process, right? So you're not just testing them, and you are testing them, of course, for all the things on your list, but you also need to make sure that they get a 360 view of the company themselves. The worst interview processes I've been a part of as a candidate is where I was being shielded from exec peers I wanted to speak to because maybe it was a confidential search or whatever it was. But I even some of them I actually got to offer stage and I was like, I'm unable to contemplate this offer because I've not had an opportunity to develop a full understanding of this challenge. I don't know who my peers are really. I've met 2 out of 8 or whatever. I don't feel like I've had a chance to evaluate you as a company, as a team. I don't understand your team dynamics. I don't understand what puzzle piece I am here and how I fit into the picture. And so, I'm not going to be able to move forward on this basis. And so it's really important, I think, that the process is comprehensive from their perspective too. They need to understand who you are as a company. You need to, and I think it's like with these hires, you don't need to sugarcoat anything. I mean, these people are experienced. They've been in companies. They know it's chaos. Even the best companies that look shiny and have crazy valuations are freaking chaotic inside. And, things go wrong all the time. There's big fires burning everywhere. These people know that. So you don't have to kind of seem like, you're this fantastic place that they're joining, that they're just going to, make a little bit shinier. No, it's like probably a shit show. And you should be honest about that so that they can match their, shit show curing skills to the kind of shit show you currently have and decide if they in fact have the right skills for it. So yeah, I would definitely deliver a lot of clarity through that process as well.
And I would assume that as somebody who now operates in a portfolio environment, that the experience becomes more important because you're not just working one search at one company. There's a relationship to be built over a long term that might not only increase their engagement for each reach out, but might entice them if they're on the fence about committing to a project because they now have this relationship of, how if not for this one, then other one, that work will not like kind of go lost, right? It's like I remember at Uber, and I know we're coming up on time here, so but at Uber, we used to hire general managers for cities, and it required a city presentation that was in front of everybody. And towards the end, I'm like coaching people through the deck, and this is what you need to do. I'm building a rubric for our team on like what are the subjectives of communication skills and presence, so that we could at least debate whether or not someone has that enough to stand in front of a city government or whatever. Right? There's all different types of things that you could do, all different types of process nuance to try to align group teams to an executive hiring structure, as well as prepare that executive or that perspective new hire for the experience. And as personal as leaving something in their room to ensure that they remember you or the process, down to something that candidate would never see, which is like developing a rubric for some subjective competency that's happening in a
Yeah.
presentation or an exercise evaluation process. Like, the
Yeah.
most painful thing for me is some exec would do it the city presentation. It would be like 30, 40, 50, 60 slides of like, here's how I'd approach it. And
Mm.
then we would just say no before they ever had a chance to present it. And they're like, "Ah." And so, yeah, I was like,
Um,
anyway, such a interesting world. But I would say for anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more about Daniel's style of executive hiring, I'm going to release a kind of a blog summary of this. I might actually update the intake session interview rubric form that we have now to kind of
sure.
expand it to some executive structure that just kind of aligns on some of these things. And in the career ladder, we do have some of the competencies that separate different layers of leadership. So I might package that all together and put something together for this newsletter that might help folks kind of get a handle on executive hiring. But, where do you learn from? Like, if you could uh, give our listeners somewhere to go that was helpful in you learning, about your craft, about executive hiring, or just about being a head of people or in a
Yeah.
leadership position overall, where would you send people? What do you find interesting for this crowd to go?
Yeah. Um, let me name two resources. So one is a book called The Culture Map. If you are someone that is working with an international team, whether that's at the exec level or any other level in the company, you will inevitably have come across cultural challenges. You know, can be as simple as people from some cultures have maybe slightly more of a tendency to not be punctual, for example, than people from some other cultures. But it can be as nuanced as um, you know h- how you deliver constructive feedback is very different in France versus the US versus say Japan. It was like an immense eye opener for me. And this, by the way, comes into play with exec hiring too, because if you understand the person's cultural background, you're gonna look at them at a different lens, and you're gonna be maybe have higher expectations in some regards, and also forgive some other things because of kind of that cultural backdrop. So immensely helpful in terms of framing the cultural map of your organization in terms of where people are coming from. So that's one I would say. The second thing I'd highlight is the Acquired podcast, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. It's just an amazing business history podcast. I think you'll learn a lot about businesses and how even the best, most iconic businesses are, as I sort of to pick up on the theme earlier, or a shit show at some point. For instance, there's a recent one on Coca-Cola. The podcast kind of goes into detail about a disastrous contract that they entered into, which ultimately was also constrained that helped them in kind of unexpected ways. So, like, you just learn so much about business, and I think it gives you some confidence about um, you know what you're dealing with isn't in your role as a business leader or operator isn't unique. Difficulties, challenges, problems are everywhere. Fires are everywhere. It's just about sort of figuring out what the next step is. And I think that podcast has helped me create that perspective.
Yeah, that I would say having the portfolio experience for me and just seeing the same problem. I mean, it led me to create Headcount 365. I saw the same problem overall. I thought I was just, maybe these startups don't invest in a headcount thing, so I have to do the spreadsheet, yada yada yada. So that perspective is what changed my career trajectory. So the more repetitions that you do, whether it's your company or your career or just learning from others, I always recommend the learning from others. The more information you have to make decisions, and sometimes the less um I don't want to say emotional, but like, things hurt less when you know it's happening to everybody. It's not a you thing. It's not a personal thing. It's just kind of the nature of business. And then we're entering into a very interesting business time where things are shifting based on like the future of work. And so it will be an interesting trajectory, particularly at the portfolio level, as people leverage hiring differently in the future. But the culture map's great. I'm going to check that out, and I'll put a link to that book in Amazon, both in the podcast below, and then when we feature this episode on the page, which will go out sometime mid-January. Thank you so much for joining me. I probably could have done 2 hours with you today, and so sorry if we didn't get a chance. I did
No,
want to dive into the comp side of things, but maybe for another time. Super
sounds
interesting to
good.
hear your perspective. I love listening to people who come into the people space from different angles, and this was no exception. So, stay tuned for this episode and others on unicorntalent.com. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. Take care. Have a good one.